I've talked a lot about software first thinking versus process first thinking. Let me differentiate the two. Process first thinking is typically derived from a service architecture. So a service architecture, you have someone who's requesting that service, typically a stakeholder, somebody who's requesting the service. They hold all the power. And as this service request moves down the supply chain kind of has to create all of the processes reactively to make sure that that demand is met. So maybe, for instance, somebody wants the translation of an InDesign file, and all of a sudden people have to create the processes that will ensure that that InDesign file is translated into however many languages with however many checks and controls for quality, etc., and is delivered correctly. So the processes, they're a reflection of the need that's being driven down the supply chain. Now, when we're talking about software first, that's different in the sense that software first will look, let's say, first at the software. Let's say there's a software that translates InDesign, and it will propose, this is what can be done with InDesign translation. You can upload an IDML file, and you're going to get a translated IDML file at the end, and that IDML file is going to be reviewed by people, and that those people can then perform linguistic checks on it, and they can perform layouting fixes and etc. Those workflows can be created, but it's within a certain framework, right? In that particular example, maybe it's not going to be that difference between process first and software first. But when you add lots of these different kinds of examples, you're going to begin to notice a big rift between software first and process first. So process first is all about accommodating demands reactively. And this is very typical for translation agencies. So maybe, for instance, a translation agency, they are very strong in medical translations, but all of a sudden they get an interpreting request, and it's from one of their big clients. They can't say no. They don't want to lose that business. They don't want to risk that. So they're going to come up with solutions for that. And maybe the next day they come up with some voiceover requirement. They're also going to work around their requirements. So typically agencies have been, over the years, very, very good at creating, improvising, and effectively drawing out these processes that will enable them to meet and typically exceed stakeholder requirements. And while that has been amazing in the past 20, 30 years, I mean, this kind of thinking led to multi-million-dollar companies all over the world. This kind of thinking, in my opinion, is also with its days kind of counted, and I'll explain why. The problem with process-first thinking is that it begins to be very stifling. You can't make a lot of changes because everything is coming from top down. So let's say, for instance, now it's no longer effective to receive a request via email, because now you have all this additional time. Someone's going to have to monitor the email box. Maybe you have to have a software ticketing system that's going to transform that into a ticket. Someone's going to have to download these files. Someone's going to have to upload these files into software for analysis. Someone's going to have to download that log file. And assuming maybe you're going to have some level of integrations, but all these steps are still necessary. Somebody's still going to have to prepare a quote, send out a quote. And when you think about all these different steps for a single file, maybe that file is only going to be like $20 or $30. The process itself becomes more expensive than the translation itself, than the good itself. And that's something that's going to become more and more common as the per word value declines because of the rise of generative AI. And I also see that trend as inevitable. So the challenge with software first thinking is that it's a lot less flexible. And because of that, if you think about, a business that's entirely built on flexibility, entirely built on being able to understand stakeholder requirements and transform that into processes, right? That has been the driving force for translation agencies. Once that's gone, what's left, right? So we're talking about resignifying their entire identity. Software is hard, literally. Software is hard in the sense that it's not as flexible as a process. A process, I can write anything down in a sheet of paper. I can make it happen. What's the process? Well, the process is you go into Google Sheets, you create a new line item, and you grab that line item from this other spreadsheet, and you download this, and you put that over email, and then you run a script, and you do it. You can write anything down on paper and make that real, right? Processes are entirely flexible. You can do absolutely anything with a process. Software is hard. And granted, with technological advances that are to come, I do expect software to become software to become softer, but that's not going to happen overnight. That's going to be a long process over the next few years. For the time being, software is pretty hard. And the other thing about software thinking is that it's not just about what the software does, but it's about even the business model. So in the process first approach, An agency can do anything, right? They can take on a new language, they can take on a new service type, they can take on anything that's within their realm. With software first thinking, specialization becomes a lot more important because it's very hard to improve if you're doing a little bit of everything. It's just incredibly hard to improve, right? Think about it. If you're someone who specializes in Japanese translations for chemical engineering, it's relatively simple over time for you to get to know all of the translators that do chemical engineering into Japanese, for you to really get to know those subject matter experts, for you to establish the perfect software that's going to tackle exactly that use case, for you to build integrations and really deepen your ability to be absolutely the best in that. The challenge is that our business in translation and localization isn't really compatible with that kind of thought because people demand generalists, right? That same person that's requesting that Japanese chemical engineering translation, in the very next day, they're going to request another translation that's legal into German, and maybe another person is going to request another translation that's going to be maybe an interpreting job, maybe something with multimedia. So our world, our universe is very diverse by nature. But most agencies, if you take a look under the hood, most agencies are going to have their bread and butter. So maybe their bread and butter is going to be medical translations. Maybe their bread and butter is going to be interpretation. Maybe their bread and butter is going to be solution building. It doesn't matter what their bread and butter is. In my opinion, what the moment calls for is greater emphasis in that bread and butter. And that's where the really hard thing comes. In my opinion, typically to grow, a step back is required to take then 2 steps forward. This step back is about trimming things that are not within that core. If you trim things that are not within the core, you will see revenue drop. You will see potential loss in customers. It's something hard, right? If you reach out to a customer and say, I know that we've been handling your translations for instance, video, but I cannot do video anymore. I'm not going to do it. Thank you so much. You run the risk of losing the entire business, right? So these decisions aren't easy, and I'm not, by no means do I think people should make these decisions, but there's definitely a cost-benefit analysis that needs to be understood as far as reconsidering whether certain revenue lines make sense or not. So let's consider an agency, and you take, for instance, an agency that specializes, their bread and butter, let's say, are legal documents into German and French, just as an example. But at the same time, they get occasional requests into Korean and Japanese. They also get occasional videos, and for most agencies that do this, they won't necessarily have all of these specialties. Maybe the Korean and Japanese translations, for instance, they're okay because they have established vendors and it's the same processes and the same software that they're using to run the other stuff. But maybe some other kinds of requests that they're getting, maybe it's an interpreting solution, maybe it's a certified translation solution that they are currently offering, that's taking a disproportionate amount of bandwidth from their team, from their leadership to keep alive. And that's where a cost-benefit analysis comes into play, right? Let's say you assess that cost-benefit and you realize that it costs you a lot, but at the same time, that's what's keeping you your largest account. Maybe you're out of luck, you have to keep it. But if you realize that a lot of these processes are costing you more than they're giving you, when you're really cold about them, right? When you're not looking just at top line revenue, when you're looking at net revenue or net earnings perspective, and you're very honest about those net earnings and not diluting that line item with other more profitable line items, looking at that by itself, it's likely that most agencies would probably trim at least 20 to 30% of their businesses because that's the inefficient part. And again, maybe not all of it, because some of this inefficient part is strategic and you need to keep it. Let's call it 15%, 20%. There's some trimmable aspect of that. And what that does is that creates so much more focus on the agency. What agencies need more than anything, in my opinion, is bandwidth. Bandwidth is the most valuable commodity at a time like this because companies need people to be able to think about solutions. People need to be able to think about what they're going to do next. Companies need leadership to propose new things, and bandwidth is what allows that, right? And if all that bandwidth is consumed by creating quotes, by running crazy processes, by spending a disproportionate amount of time to deliver a very specialized kind of project that doesn't happen that often. If you have loss of bandwidth, you are losing the very fuel, the very possibility of change. And that's the key thing that's going to keep us relevant in the next 10 to 20 years is this drive towards change. So the way, in my opinion, you drive this bandwidth is through software first thinking. if you have software running your business and not so this is another key differentiator, right? Most translation agencies I talk to, they consider themselves tech enabled, but the definition for a tech enabled business, in my opinion, is very low. What's a business that's not tech-enabled these days? I mean, technically, if you have a Google Sheets with your projects and your quotes, you're tech-enabled, right? You're using tech to manage your business. Honestly, like if the bar is that low, I don't know a single business in the world that's not tech-enabled. But then maybe they have a specialized software to manage that, a specialized business management system or specialized translation management system, whatever they call it. Still, the bar is very low, right? What does tech-enabled mean? Is it a spreadsheet on wheels, or is it actually running the business for them? And this is the key thing. And I think that there are two very different categories for tech. There's tech that stores human information, and there's tech that drives human information. So the tech that stores the human information, let's say you're preparing a quote as a project manager, you're entering the numbers manually, or you're importing a log file into that quote, but you're the driver. Tech that drives human information, that's for instance a tech that you upload a file and it gives you the quote amount because it knows the business rules and it knows the file, it can understand that, it can give you that quote amount. And what people need these days more than ever is this second kind of tech that's actually driving businesses, because that frees up bandwidth. Think about it. If you have project managers who are spending each 10 minutes on every single quote, and they're preparing, let's say for instance, of 100 quotes a week, that means that 1,000 minutes are lost just preparing quotes. And let's say, for instance, they're placing task assignments and they're spending at least 30 minutes per task assignments, and they also have this time not just 100, maybe they have 500 task assignments because most projects go into several languages. Now they're spending 15,000 minutes a week on task assignments. So these things, they multiply and they eat up all of the bandwidth. And then you have all of the repercussions of that as well, because now these task assignments don't always work out super well. Maybe people have late deliveries, maybe they have quality issues around them. So these things mushroom, right? And if you have that part figured out from a software management perspective, you really free up all of this priceless bandwidth to focus on business change and transformation. So that's why, in my opinion, software first thinking is so valuable. Yes, it's less flexible than process first thinking. Yes, it may require changing things around as far as how you do certain things, but the return on that investment is so disproportionately big because you get bandwidth. And with that bandwidth, you get to stay relevant, you get to stay creative, you get to propose things. But those are my thoughts and opinions on the subject. Would love to know your comments. Please leave them below. Thank you again for watching. Take care. Till the next time.